Morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday the 9th of April. Just getting ready to record the roundtable discussion.
To attack the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad has attracted widespread support. He's receiving praise from many people who just can't stand the man, including his old nemesis, Hillary Clinton, and the neoconservatives who played a leading role in the Iraq invasion of 2003. So, was this action justified? To what extent has US policy changed? What next for Syria? And what does all this mean for North Korea and a possible strike on Pyongyang? Now remember, all this took place as the US president met with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, in Florida. To get to the bottom of all this, we have an internationally acclaimed panel. John Mearsheimer is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. John, great to have you back on Radio National.
I'm glad to be here, Tom.
Ewan Graham is Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Great to see you again, Ewan.
Good morning, Tom.
And John McCarthy is arguably Australia's most experienced diplomat and former ambassador, having served in Washington, Tokyo, Jakarta, Delhi, Bangkok, and when he was a young chap, nearly 40 years ago, in Damascus. G'day, John.
Tom.
John Mearsheimer, let's start with you. Were these strikes on the Assad regime a smart move by the president?
No, I don't think they were a smart move. I think in the end they don't matter that much. I mean, the question you want to ask yourself is, what was the objective of these attacks? And what's the particular strategy that Trump has in mind for achieving those objectives? Now, the administration has made a lot of noise about getting rid of Assad, toppling the regime. But I don't think anybody seriously believes that a one-off attack like this is going to have any effect on getting rid of Assad. And if anything, it would give the Russians more incentive than ever, and the Iranians more incentive than ever to prop up Assad. Then some people make the argument that we did this to prevent further use of chemical weapons. And there I would say it's not clear that the Assad government used chemical weapons. They might have, but we don't have real hard evidence at this point. But if they did use chemical weapons, I'm not sure that this one-time strike will prevent them from using it in the future, because the Syrians surely understand the Russians are there to protect them.
Well, I mean, on that note, what's the difference between killing people with conventional weapons, and we've seen 400,000 deaths in Syria over the last 6 years? What's the difference between killing people with conventional weapons and killing them with chemical weapons? Ewan?
Well, if you come at it from a purely humanitarian viewpoint, then that is a double standard. But I think that should not stand in the way of the vital importance of defending the global norm of chemical weapons use. That's why I favour, despite some of the perhaps grubby politics around this decision, the strike, because I do believe that will deter Assad from using chemical weapons in the same way against civilians in future.
Yeah, well, we've been here before, John McCarthy, because in late August of 2013, Assad did use chemical weapons, and that crossed the famous red line that President Obama had set down. But question here is, if the world is so concerned that people have been killed, the US would have intervened in Syria over the last 6 years, because hundreds of thousands of people were killed, right?
Well, they were, but I think in this particular instance, several factors are driving Trump. The first is the need to do something. This is an administration which is in some disarray, and it's good politics for Trump to appear decisive and do something which can be perceived in the American national interest. The other thing is it differentiates him from Obama, and that is a very crucial aspect of the way Trump looks on the world right now. Obama had this problem in 2013 when he didn't follow up when he laid down the red line. Trump has shown that he's different and hence more decisive. And I think also another factor which may be at the back of his mind and the mind of his advisors, to some degree it gets the Russian monkey off his back, to some degree. He's under enormous pressure on this issue of the links between him and his supporters and the Russians before the election. By being seen to take action which is contrary to Putin's interest, it can be portrayed as a decisive move, again in the American national interest at this particular juncture.
Well, John, in Chicago, what do you make of that? Because, I mean, John McCarthy would say that this episode shows that Trump is more decisive than the vacillating Obama, but Trump's also an impulsive character here, isn't he? Because he's just done a complete 180.
Well, I think that John McCarthy is absolutely right, that from the point of view of domestic politics and Trump's political problems, that this makes sense, at least in the short term. But my main concern is what is the impact of this strike on Syria and also on Russian relations. And when John says it gets the Russian monkey off Trump's back, I think that's true in the sense that Trump has been under tremendous pressure from both the right and the left of the United States to get tough on the Russians. He, of course, wanted to have some sort of rapprochement with Putin, and this pushes him in the other direction. The question you have to ask yourself, is that good or bad? And my argument would be that Trump was going in the right direction by trying to improve relations with the Russians. And indeed, if you talk about Syria per se, I think we have to work with the Russians and with Iran, as distasteful as that may be to many people, if we have any hope of shutting down this war. The idea that we can have antagonistic relations with the Russians in Syria and solve the problem of Syria in the process, I think, is wrong-headed. And furthermore, we run the danger, if we begin to ramp up our use of military force, of actually ending up in a shooting war with the Russians.
The unintended consequences of this action, Ewan.
Well, I'd agree that the United States does not historically have the levers of influence that Russia and Iran do in Syria. That's why they must be part of a settlement. And I wouldn't underestimate the level of private frustration that now, more than a year in, the Russians have with dealing with Assad. And that although those assurances were apparently given by the United States to Russia, that in a way, I think, behind the scenes, I would not be surprised if there was a level of private tacit agreement that the Russians see some value in the extra pressure being applied to Assad.
But John McCarthy, why would the Russians want to see a transition in Damascus when, let's face it, the Assad family has pretty much run the show in Syria for the best part of half a century?
Well, at the end of the day, Assad is an embarrassment. The Russians don't necessarily want to see Assad in Damascus. They want to see a regime that is basically compatible with their interests in Damascus. The difficulty they face is how do you bring about a change at the top in the regime in Damascus, given that the Assad family is so inseparable to the whole Alawite hierarchy in Damascus. That's the problem they face. But at the end of the day, if you're going to move Assad out, it really has to be the Russians and the Iranians that do it. It will be very difficult for the Americans to do it. And indeed, I think the Russians would resist that.
And perhaps one should not downplay the possibility that Trump, who's all about the art of the deal, might do some grand bargain with Putin on this very issue. We wait and see. But you said that Assad was an embarrassment, but he's not an embarrassment for the many Shia, Alawite, and of course Christians who support his regime. And this brings me back to you, John, in Chicago. To what extent is this a morally ambiguous conflict? So just to put this in some sort of broader context, we've got an Iranian and Hezbollah-backed brutal Shia-aligned dictatorship, that's the Assad regime in Damascus. They're essentially fighting a plethora of Sunni jihadists, including Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Question, John, does America have a dog in this fight?
Well, the question is, do we have a dog in this fight strategically? In other words, is Syria of great strategic importance to the United States, and does it matter whether the Assad regime survives or not? I would argue that Syria is of hardly any strategic importance to the United States, and what happens there matters very little. I think the principal reason for supporting Assad is actually a moral reason. What's very important to do here is just to stop all the killing. And the question is, how do you do that? And I think, and I'm sad to say this, there's only one way to do it, and that is to work with the Russians, as both you and John were hinting at, and try to prop up the Assad regime and restore stability to Syria. The sad truth is that when you look at the Middle East, and you look at countries like Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and you look at Syria under the Assads, and you look at Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, the truth is those countries were more stable and there was less conflict when those dictators were in power. And when you topple those regimes, you end up unleashing all these centrifugal forces that tear the country apart and produce a conflict where, hundreds of thousands of people get killed. So when all is said and done, I'd rather have Assad in power than have a continuation of the Civil War.
But Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, John, just staying with you in Chicago, he has said that the US policy now is basically that they see no case for Assad leading Syria. So he basically supports regime change. To the extent that that is now the US policy, doesn't that contradict your analysis?
No, it fundamentally contradicts my analysis, but Rex Tillerson is living in a dreamland. I mean, we're not going to get rid of Assad. And the point I would make is that by, striking against Syria and antagonizing the Russians, it makes it all that much more difficult to get rid of Assad, because if anything, you're giving the Russians and the Iranians more incentive than ever to keep Assad in power. The Russians are saying to themselves at this point in time, we'll be darned if we're going to let the Americans, topple Assad. So if anything, we're making it more difficult to get rid of him. So I don't know what Tillerson is talking about.
And on that note, Ewan, I mean, the Russians will say they have strategic assets in Syria. They have a port in Tartus on the eastern Mediterranean. What's in it for the Russians to see the end of Assad?
Well, they don't. I mean, I think that the Russians clearly want to protect and preserve their interests. But let's not underestimate, as I said before, the level of frustration that the Russians now feel, and the economic pressures that Putin will be feeling to downscale the level of Russian involvement. So I think he's trying to find a way out of Syria, not a way out that will mean the Russians won't be present anymore, but certainly a way out of their involvement in the conflict.
John? Yes, I agree. I think a real issue here is what to do about ISIS. And that looms up all the time.
Because that's getting missed here.
Well,
the main enemy of Assad in this part of the world are these Islamic State jihadists.
I think the main...
Supported by Saudi Arabia and the Turks.
Yeah, I mean, Assad's worried by a whole lot of people, but ISIS is probably the most important single force against him. And I think what we need to bear in mind is that the reason the Americans went back there, it was essentially ISIS. The reason we're involved there is essentially ISIS. It's not about Assad and getting rid of Assad. So throughout all this, what the American hierarchy needs to bear in mind that the people who are going to be most helpful to them in getting rid of ISIS are actually the Iranians, supported by the Russians and, of course, the regime in Damascus, whoever heads it, but it's basically Assad. So there's this constant balance that has to be retained. And if the focus shifts too much on the removal of Assad for very obvious humanitarian reasons, we'll tend in the West to lose sight of our other strategic objectives.
My guests are John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, Ewan Graham from the Lowy Institute, and the former ambassador, John McCarthy. Now, this US strike on Syria adds, an extra measure of weight to the president's call for China to rein in North Korea's nuclear program. Last week, Trump told the Financial Times that if China did not rein in Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions, the US will. Ewan, how can Washington stop Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions?
Well, that's a question that's dogged successive US administrations, so at least Bill Clinton onwards. There's no easy solution, and Mr. Trump appears to be going through the same learning curve as his predecessors, and particularly in relying on China to do the hard job of coercing North Korea. I think there's a genuine level of frustration on the Chinese side that they don't have those levers of persuasion. Yes, they could turn the lights out by cutting off energy supplies to North Korea, but North Korea has proved very adept at flying below the radar of sanctions. They know the value of North Korea as a buffer to China, and they're able to play off that. And North Korea's, if you like, strategic genius is that it's able to live within China's strategic shadow, even at the expense of China's interests.
Well, you were on CNN this week saying that Kim's latest missile test was, quote, an airborne middle finger to Trump and Xi before they sit down for the summit.
Well, you could say there were some fingers that were plied in the reverse direction. Some people have made the point that the decision to strike Syria at precisely the moment when Trump and Xi sat down to dinner was making a dual point. Now, I wouldn't want to overplay that, but I think...
By Jesus, I would. I thought it was exactly what was going on. Upload limit, back immediately.